Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, continuing our series on the deep state, the formation of the deep state, and its relevance to the assassination of JFK in November 22nd, 1963. Of course, if you go all the way back to the beginning of this series, in part one, we started with the end of the Civil War. So we're talking about over 100-year span. And there are three definitions that I have hammered over and over and over again that are absolutely crucial to understanding this deep state or power elites, whatever you want to call them. And it's the definition, the working definition that I'm using for this particular series. Now, understand the deep state today has morphed into something else. Okay, so it's not just the national security apparatus. There's an entire bureaucracy now that has incentive and they're all unaccountable. They're all unelected, just like the original deep state. That are incentivized to operate against the wishes of the American people in their own interests, in their own selfish interests. But we're talking about this particular time period and how it related to the assassinations in the 1960s. It morphs into something else after the end of the Cold War. But this is the height of the Cold War period we're discussing. So the definition that we are using is the national security apparatus in all the industries that fed it or feed it. And the that's the first definition. That if you understand that, a lot becomes self-explanatory going forward. The second definition I want you to keep in mind or concept is the concept of ultra-vires. Ultra-vires was a concept that applied to the private sector during the rise of corporations, and it meant that there was a focused pursuit of profits. It didn't matter what the public interest was. It only mattered what the profit motive was. So the overall objective of corporate America during the rise of corporations, and I'm talking about the robber barons, the big industrialists, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the JP Morgans, the Carnegies, et cetera, was to maximize profits. And if that happened to jive with public interest, so be it. But that wasn't the overriding concern. The overriding concern was profits. Public interest didn't matter. In fact, you could be fired if it was determined that you were acting in the private interest. Now, the second part of that is the concept of immunity, which is to immunize yourself so you don't ever face consequences, whether legal or civil or otherwise, for any of your actions in the pursuit of those profits. You always walk away unscathed. Consequences are for little people, not for the big people. So when you understand ultravirus in the private sector and how it morphed through the Spanish American War, World War I, and World War II into the public sector and was invited in by two progressive presidents in succession. Woodrow Wilson during World War One, FDR during World War II. In order to run the wartime economy, he invited in these so-called private sector experts. They brought with them into the public sector their private sector beliefs about ultravirus. And that is why so many Americans today ask the question, when they look at what our government is doing, they ask the question, what in the world are they thinking? This is not in the public interest. This is not what the people want. But that's not even a concern anymore to the government. And that is largely because the public sector adopted the private sector mentality that profits matter more than anything else, or benefit. You could turn the word into benefit. Whatever is beneficial to them and to their interests and the ones that they represent, that's what matters, not the public interest. And then the second part of that is when you recognize that these people who make these decisions never face culpability. They never face accountability. Even if they're elected, they skate in a lot of cases because they've mastered the art of immunization, just like the private sector ultravirus years and years ago. The third definition is treason. And there's several parts to treason. Treason is basically betraying your country, aiding and abetting the enemy, fighting a war against your country, or overthrowing your own country's government, or in this case, executing the king. These are aspects of treason. And when you put those three definitions together, those three concepts together, uh, the formation of a deep state, the adoption of ultra vires into the public sector, and the carrying out of treason by traitors who don't mind selling out the interests of their own country because, again, it countermands their own self-interests or their interests that they represent. It helps one understand how a cabal of traitors could rise to such to could uh, conceive of such a traitorous action as executing their own president in broad daylight. Just understanding those three concepts or understand the definitions of those three terms. We've been focusing on LBJ lately. Now, here's what happens. In my research over the years, what I've learned is that the deep state, which is often referred to as some amorphous, nameless, shapeless blob, and that is nice and convenient for the people that make up the deep state because no one can hold them personally accountable, is actually made up of people. In every one of these entities and interests, there are people behind the scenes who are represented. And I've gone through quite a few. I've tried to, for example, I believe the Dulles brothers were some of the first useful instruments of this deep state, which I indicated were these corporate interests. And, if you want to go back, these corporate interests were interested in rebuilding Germany after World War One. These corporate interests were interested in maximizing profits in Europe, return on their investment. These corporate interests were interested then when the war broke out in protecting those interests and those investments and the infrastructure that they had built in Europe. So they used as one of their useful instruments Allen Dulles to negotiate a secret peace with the Germans so as to protect, to kind of force a secret surrender so as to protect in the final days of the war their investments, their infrastructure projects in Europe and Italy and Germany, other places. Uh, Even though he was literally going against the direct order of his commander in chief, which was to say FDR negotiated with FDR and with Churchill, and they both promised Stalin they would never negotiate a secret peace with the Germans. It would be as allies, one for all for one. Allen Dulles literally disobeyed that. That's treason. He disobeyed the order of his commander in chief, and then in the aftermath helped bring into America all these former Nazis, helped them escape justice at Nuremberg so as to bring their expertise to America and help us in the next war, which is the Cold War. That was the beginning of Allen Dulles' useful service to the deep state. You become one of these deep state figures not as a result of one decision, but as a result of 1,000 decisions. And then one day you wake up and you are them. You've become the deep state. So by the time we get to 63, and Allen Dulles is now over the CIA, or early 63, and he is authorizing programs of assassination overseas, executive action, programs of assassination domestically, ZR rifle, programs of mind control first against foreign populations and secondly against our own citizens, MK Ultra. You can see where time after time after time, Allen Dulles has made decisions that are furthering his usefulness to this deep state and bringing him closer and closer to the abyss himself. So by the time we get to the assassination of JFK and then the follow-up, which the investigation, the Warren Commission, and he is basically running it, he now fulfills the second part of that. He's already countermanded the public interest time after time after time. Now he's in the business of immunizing all the plotters, including himself and the agency that he ran. So you see it with his brother, John Foster. You see it with LBJ, how for years he made 1,000 decisions that put him on a path towards becoming a useful instrument for the deep state. And specifically this event we're aiming for, which is the assassination of JFK. But he didn't get there. He didn't go from point A to point Z overnight. There are a lot of small steps in between that showed his bona fides to these deep staters and the usefulness that he would bring uh, necessarily as the next president of the United States and how convenient that would be. So that's what I've been trying to establish is these deep staters in the Pentagon, like Curtis LeMay, uh, these deep staters in the national security apparatus, like the CIA director Alan Dulles, and the State Department, like John Foster Dulles, even up to and including the White House, which will culminate in LBJ, Richard Nixon, and people like that. Uh, and then there's people at the congressional level, at the senatorial level. There's people. You still got the big business interests. We just got done talking about H.L. Hunt and all the big oil people, Brown and Root Construction. We talked about the General Dynamics and Bell Helicopter. All these big companies that make up this national security apparatus. These are the companies that make the weapons of war that we need for war. So they are definitely within that national security apparatus. And of course, included within that would be law enforcement, like J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, who you're going to need because a lot of the schemes and the scams and the rackets that you're running are illegal. You got to protect the right people, for years. And I would include certain mafiosos in that worked hand in hand with our government in trying to achieve foreign policy objectives, like, for example, overthrowing the government of Cuba, assassinating Fidel Castro. They were useful instruments. And as such, they needed to be protected because their whole enterprise is illegal. And who, for years, denied the existence of a mafia, saying it was made up, it was a hoax. It was J. Edgar Hoover. I could go on and on and on. Anyway, J. Edgar Hoover, I'm sorry, LBJ, who coincidentally is best friends with J. Edgar Hoover, is the name we're talking about right now. And I get such a kick out of people who try to minimize the role that LBJ had in the JFK assassination. And you can't. His fingerprints are all over it, before, during, and after, up to and including even where it happened. I mean, you just can't ignore it. Today's topic is Malcolm Mac Wallace, who is we've been talking about LBJ's friends, the Sweet 8F group, all these people that were hand in hand racketeering. They were sort of LBJ was their poster child. He was the guy that they at the top of the triangle. He was the guy they were pushing upward and onward in his political career so that one day he could become president and they could take their rackets in the state of Texas nationwide or even international. But there were a lot of other people in that Sweet 8F group. And we've talked about a few of them, but I gave you a long list of them, and that wasn't even the total list. But you understand my point. He had surrounded himself with like-minded people, and he was, to put it bluntly, the symbol of everything Sweet 8F stood for. You just look at Lyndon Baines Johnson, his ethics, his morals, his criminal background, his histories of crimes, even going back so far as 48 when he stole the Senate election. He gets nowhere in life legitimately. Everything he accomplished was illegitimate. And it was at the behest and for these Sweet 8F conspirators, and they helped carry all that out. So as you in your mind think of LBJ, that's how you should gauge everyone else in that Sweet 8F group. They were all capable of the exact same thing because they were all involved in it. They were all carrying it out. They were all making decisions on a monthly basis to carry out this crime and that racket. It was all in furtherance of their selfish interest, which was to make money and gain power. And that was a small microcosm of the larger deep state, which was operating out of DC. which when he, became vice president and later president, it, the two just morphed into one and became one and the same. So let's talk about Malcolm Wallace. He's a former U.S. Marine, and so he had military background. So obviously, he'd been trained as a sniper, and he was a smart guy at the same time. People sometimes underestimate somebody like Malcolm Wallace, who has a history of violent crime, and they think he's dumb. He's not. He was actually University of Texas student body president at one time. He's very political, even as a student, and wanted to be a politician. That was his aspiration. And he rose through the ranks after University of Texas, ends up at Columbia University where he's working on his doctorate. He taught at a university, Long Island. He taught at the University of Texas, and he taught at the University of North Carolina. This is an intellectual. Okay, he's got bona fides as far as the military is concerned, but he's also an intellectual. He is on path to becoming a politician of some sort. He's on that path. He's got all the education you could want. He's got the bona fides. I haven't been an instructor at the university level. He's been in the Marines, and he's from Texas, which is a large state, and he's a Democrat, which is what you have to be from the South. So, as such, he is viewed as an up and comer. And so Ed Clark, who is we talked about all the attorneys that were in LBJ's orbit, and the reason he had all these attorneys so they could hatch all these crimes and then never have to be called as a witness. They were protected by attorney-client privileges, so that was nice and convenient. Anyway, one of the main movers and shakers of that group of attorneys was Ed Clark, and so he introduces to LBJ, who by this time is a senator. He introduces Mac Wallace to him. This guy, that he's somebody we might want to keep an eye on. We could invest in this guy. He could be useful to us. That's how it works. Just like there was I forget his name right now, but there was a very prominent politician out of Texas who invested his time and efforts into LBJ at one time. Now LBJ, it's his turn to do the same for another up and comer. And so we get to 1950, and LBJ, through his connections, gets a job for Mac Wallace working at the Department of Agriculture. And this is an important job in Texas because I mentioned this in an earlier video. You remember there are no natural lakes, for example, in the state of Texas. Every lake in Texas is built by a result of a dam and the creation of a reservoir. That's all handled out of Washington. That money to build all that stuff comes out of Washington, USDA, Department of Agriculture, and eventually makes its way to the state where people like Mac Wallace will distribute it. And of course, if Mac Wallace owes his job to LBJ, he's going to distribute it per LBJ's instructions. He is LBJ's man at the Department of Agriculture. And you're going to see going forward why this is so important. It's not just the making of the dams and stuff. LBJ has other scams going that are directly under the supervision of the Department of Agriculture. And he needs his people at that department so that his scams don't get investigated or discovered. During this time, and here we go, the oldest, I don't know what you want to call it. It's tripped up more up and coming, promising people, men in particular, in this world, throughout world history, than just about anything else, and that's love, illicit love, or loving the wrong person, or you go back to Samson in the Bible, right? He gets involved in a love triangle, and it's with LBJ's sister and a golf pro who operates out of a golf club in Austin named John Kinzer. And the it's like one of these things you'd see in the National Enquirer or one of these tabloid TV shows. And he's jealous of Kinzer. And of course, he's met Josepha Johnson via the relationship, by way of the relationship that he has with LBJ. And he's in love with her, but she's in love with Kinzer. And where it becomes a problem that involves LBJ is that all of a sudden Kinzer gets the idea, and it's really Josepha's idea. And she goes to Kinzer and says, we could extort my brother. My brother's rich. My brother is making more money as a senator than he knows what to do with. We could, and I know what he's up to. I could spill the beans on him. I could blackmail him. We could get some money out of him. They began extorting LBJ, and of course, Kinzer is the one this is how it works, right? Josefa has the idea, but she puts Kinzer up to it. So Kinzer is the one trying to negotiate this blackmail. And so if you're LBJ, your enemy is Kinzer. And so in 1951, Wallace goes to the pitch and putt golf course office in Austin, gets in an argument with Kinzer, ends up shooting him. Now, it if you had to if I had to guess what his motive was in that moment, I would say it was because he was mad that Kinzer was sleeping with his girlfriend, Josefa. But he was also aware of this other thing, this extortion, this blackmail. And of course, if you're LBJ, you don't care who Josefa's sleeping with. You care about this extortion, this blackmail. Uh, it's never been completely determined what the motive was as far as Wallace was concerned. Of course, it worked to LBJ's advantage when Wallace went to court to call it a lover's quarrel or a love triangle gone bad. That's the oldest motive in the world. Everybody understands that. And of course, the other motive you can keep in the background because no one needs to know about that because then that opens up or invites people to ask the question, how did LBJ get so rich? Anyway, whether the motive was love gone bad or blackmail, the fact of the matter is Wallace, in front of witnesses, in cold blood, went in and shot John Kinzer to death. And this is where LBJ springs into action. And so that's 51. So in 52, right at the beginning of the year, Wallace resigned, it became apparent to LBJ and to his attorneys that were around him that his association with Wallace might become public, especially as a result of a trial, and especially because even if the motive at trial is determined to be a lover's quarrel gone bad, it's going to be LBJ's sister, so it's going to bring LBJ into it one way or the other. People are going to find out how he got his job at the Department of Agriculture. It's going to look like LBJ's guy killed LBJ's enemy. And so there's this quick disassociation that needs to take place. So Wallace resigns from his government job to try to distance himself from LBJ. But Wallace is defended at trial by LBJ's personal attorney, John Cofer. Remember, I've talked about all these attorneys that work at the behest and in conjunction with LBJ. John Cofer, Ed Clark, Cliff Carter. And so John Cofer, LBJ's personal attorney, represents him. Cofer's strategy is to openly admit that his client's guilty of murder. And sure enough, they ascribed the motive as being the fact that Kinzer had been sleeping with Wallace's wife. By the way, I neglected to mention this. This had gone past the point of being a lover's quarrel. Wallace and Josefa were married at this point, and so Josefa was sleeping with Kinzer, and so this looks like a vengeful husband, right? And this is a slam dunk, easy to understand motive. So the jury finds Wallace guilty of, quote, murder with malice aforethought, meaning it was premeditated. He thought about it. 11 of the jurors voted for the death penalty. The 12th argued for life imprisonment. So it's got to be unanimous. Here's where one of LBJ's judge intercedes and carries out the wishes of LBJ, Judge Charles Betts. Now, we learned in the Suite 8F section that he had judges that were in that Suite 8F group. Now, this didn't happen to be the one I named, but this is one of his judges. that LBJ controls, Charles O. Betts, overrules the jury. The jury rules murder one. They're not completely unanimous on whether he should be, uh, you know, executed, but uh, they're all at least the minimum penalty is life imprisonment for murder one. This is say Texas now. Judge Betts overrules the juries, announces from the bench a sentence of 5 years, which he then suspends, which means Wallace walks out of the courtroom a free man. It's the only time, still to this day, a in Texas history that someone convicted of murder one has been given a suspended sentence. This all happened because of LBJ. I mean, you could make an argument everything that has happened to Wallace is because of LBJ. Since Ed Clark brought him to his attention, he got the job at the Department of Agriculture. He met Josefa Meritor, uh, and now obviously he is aware of the blackmail between his wife and her lover. But he's also aware that she's sleeping around on him. And then when he commits the murder, an act of passion, whatever you want to call it, it's LBJ's attorney who represents him, comes up with his defense. It's an LBJ judge who gets him off and suspends his sentence. So clearly, Malcolm Wallace owes everything now, his life, literally, to LBJ. So now, even though he is, and here he is pictured walking out of the courtroom, free man, uh, even though he is a free man, he's on a suspended sentence. The whole state knows who he is, knows what he did. So getting a job is not going to be easy. But that doesn't really matter because LBJ and the Suite 8F group, they're the ones who have all the jobs. They own all the companies, and they have all the money and the power. So in a normal situation, a convict like this, even if he got a sweetheart deal, a convict like this is going to have a hard time getting a job. Still true today, right? Probably more true than ever because of the internet. Everybody knows what you did. It might be 7 states away. They know. So in this situation, he gets employed as a quote economic consultant by Temco. Temco is a defense contractor operating out of Dallas, and it's owned by guess who? Dryholes Bird. Dryholes Bird is one of these Suite 8F power brokers. He's also the guy who started the Civil Air Patrol, which famous for David Ferry being involved in New Orleans, one of his pupils being Lee Harvey Oswald. He's also famous for owning the Texas School Book Depository. So he's a LBJ crony, that's what he is. And so they find a job for him. In this new job, this convict, this convicted murderer gets a top secret security clearance for his new job. You just can't make this up. It's it's like when Oswald returns from Russia, having what our government, according to what we know, he'd said he was going to give military secrets to the Russians. He had defected. He tried to give up his citizenship. All these things. He comes back and gets a job down in Texas at Jagger's Child Stovall, and he has to get a top secret security clearance working for a defense contractor that looks at YouTube footage, breaks it all the photographic images, all the videos and stuff that come back from these YouTube planes and their cameras. They are developed by this company, and in order to work with this company, you have to have top secret security clearance. How in the world did he get that top secret security clearance? Well, how in the world did Mac Wallace get a top secret security clearance? When you are part of the team, when you are a useful instrument to the team, and they see potential for you going forward, they see usefulness for you, they'll cut every corner. They'll make the crooked road straight. They'll make the hilly road flat. They'll do anything to to clear the way for you to get these clearances or get these jobs, whatever. Texas Ranger Clint Peoples curious about it. He's like, how in the world did he get this top secret security clearance? This was years later. He was told politics. That was the answer. So Peoples asked, well, who could be so strong and powerful in politics that he could get a clearance for a man like this? And the answer that he gave or was given was, quote, the vice president. So this is all coming from LBJ. Of course, you just look at this on its face. It's obvious. Okay. Just giving some anecdotes to back it up. So from 52 to 57, he's working for Temco. And then 5 years later, per the decision of the court, after having been convicted of first degree murder, and 11 of the 12 jurors voting for capital punishment, the other one voting for at least life imprisonment. He got 5 years suspended. He kept his nose clean, at least as far as the court was concerned. So after 5 years, his record was wiped completely clean. And now LBJ owns him because he has taken the live bullet for LBJ, eliminated a problem that LBJ had, and he's like one of those good mafiosos. Goes to prison, keeps his mouth shut. Afterwards, he gets rewarded for it. That's exactly what's happened. LBJ and the Sweet 8F group is literally a mafia. And this is one of their capos, right? This is going to be one of their guys. And if he will abide by the strict omerta, you know, tradition, which is to not reveal what you know, but to stay quiet and take your punishment like a man, they will help him in return. Of course, his punishment was nothing like what it should have been. So he is an owned man at this point. LBJ owns him. All right, that was 57. Now, fast forward to 1960. This is why I said he had been put in the Department of Agriculture to begin with, because, and we discussed this in a previous episode, the agricultural scam that LBJ and Billy Saul Estes were involved in. It involved ammonia's hydrous ammonia. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, and and hydrous ammonia, and they were over planting on the cotton allotments when they were supposed to be letting the fields lie fallow, and they were getting subsidies on those fields when they were supposed to not be growing cotton. Instead, they were growing cotton. And in addition to the fields where they were growing cotton legitimately, they were getting paid twice. They were getting paid a subsidy on the land that they weren't supposed to be growing, and they were selling that cotton and getting paid again. So that's a scam. Then they were also selling these tanks that were fictitious. It was total fraud. And they were undercutting with all these big grants from the USDA. They were undercutting their competition and driving them all out of business, and then becoming the only ammonia uh, contractor or dealer in the state of Texas. They could charge whatever they want. In other words, Billy Saul Estes and LBJ were scamming the Department of Agriculture, which is why he put Mac Wallace in the Department of Agriculture to begin with. And he was hoping to avoid a problem like this. In 1960, Henry Marshall was asked by the AAA, the Agriculture Adjustment Administration. It goes all the way back to FDR, basically the Department of Agriculture, to investigate Billy Saul Estes. And so Marshall discovers, and I told you, any quick investigation is just a perfunctory investigation of Billy Saul Estes. All the locals knew what he was doing. Everybody knew what he was doing. So it's not going to take a genius to go down there and figure out what's going on. So Marshall discovers that over a 2-year period, Estes had purchased over 3,200 acres of cotton allotments from 116 different farmers. And of course, this is so that he can get subsidies on all these allotments, and in addition to that, grow. And you're supposed to pick one or the other. You can't do both. And he's double dipping. So in 1961, Billy Saul Estes sends his lawyer, John P. Dennison, to meet Henry Marshall at Robertson County because he realizes this guy's on to me. He's figured it out. At the meeting, this happened on January 17th, 1961, Marshall tells Dennison that Estes was clearly involved in a, quote, scheme or device to buy allotments and will not be uh, approved, and prosecution will follow if this operation is ever used. Uh, in other words, he's telling uh, Billy Saul Estes' lawyer that this scheme to buy all these cotton allotments is illegal. It won't be approved. And if he tries to go through with it, he's going to be prosecuted. So Saul Estes, who's, remember now, he's sort of the front man for this whole scheme, this whole racket down in Texas. He's front man for LBJ. They're in business together. So he has a meeting with who? LBJ's fixer, his lawyer, Cliff Carter, and LBJ. And the subject of the meeting is Henry Marshall snooping around in their business. So Johnson proposes that Marshall be promoted out of the state of Texas, thereby removing him as a problem. Let's give him a promotion. Let's offer him more money, better pay, better job, nicer title, whatever. Get him out of the state of Texas. He's a problem. So Billy Saul agrees, says, let's transfer him. Let's get him out of here, get him a better job, make him the assistant secretary of agriculture, whatever it takes to get him out of our hair. So, because in their world, this works. Bribery works. This is how they operate. And you know, it, the mob understands this better than anybody, right? Every man has his button. Some it's sex, some it's money, some it's power, some it's social whatever status, perks. Like J.B. Edgar Hoover liked getting comped in all the racetracks around the country. Everybody has their button, and so they're thinking, well, this guy's an eager beaver at the Department of Agriculture. What if we give him a promotion that caters to his need to be validated as an employee of the Department of Agriculture? He's trying to do a good job. Let's reward him for it. And in doing so, get him out of our hair. So they go back to Marshall. They propose this promotion to him. Marshall immediately rejects the idea. Oh boy, so they ran into somebody who has ethics, morals. And he knew it was a bribe. He knew it was an effort to keep him quiet. So he says, no, by the way, the top picture here is Henry Marshall. And that's Billy Saul Estes beneath him. So they have to have a second meeting on the same day. So this is all happening, bam, bam, bam. Now what do? We tried to buy him. We tried to bribe him. This time, Mac Wallace is at the meeting. Uh-oh. Mac Wallace is a convicted murderer. There's only one reason he's at this meeting. After it was pointed out that Marshall would not go to Washington, Johnson said, it looks like we're just going to get rid of him. This is according to Billy Saul Estes, who's there. Wallace was given the assignment. It said, okay, you got to get rid of Henry Marshall. So on June 3rd, 1961, so you're looking about 4 or 5 months later, Marshall was found dead on his farm by the side of his Chevy truck. And he'd been shot 5 times with a bolt-action rifle, which was lying next to him. And they said it was suicide. The county sheriff, Howard Stegall, decreed that Marshall had committed suicide. There were no pictures of the crime scene. There were no blood samples. There were stains of blood in the truck, on the truck. In fact, they took the truck out, washed it, and waxed it the following day. Interesting, think about what the Secret Service did with JFK's limo in the hours and days after Dallas. They sent it to Dearborn, Michigan to be rebuilt. It was literally a rolling crime scene, and they contaminated the crime scene by just getting rid of all the evidence. There was no check for fingerprints on the rifle or the pickup, nothing. And here is the sheriff trying to show the court how a man could take a rifle, a bolt-action rifle, and shoot himself 5 times in the gut with it. And it's so preposterous. Part of this assembly of Suite 8F conspirators within the LBJ orbit included local and state and local law enforcement, also include J. Edgar Hoover. You want to go all the way to DC. It also included judges, sheriffs, uh, law enforcement, coroners, medical examiners. They were all in on it. Judges. So you could literally get away with murder in Texas if your name was LBJ. The in a future grand jury appearance, remember Billy Solestis, and I covered this in the previous episode. He was a target. He had a big target on him from late 50s, early 60s into the 80s. He was always under investigation. This is well after LBJ is out of the presidency, even after he dies. So he had multiple grand jury appearances. And for a long time, while LBJ was still alive, Billy Solestis abided by the creed of silence. He was scared for his life, is what he was. But after LBJ died, some of that faded away and he got tired. Yeah, he's just tired of being harassed. And anyway, he eventually tells a grand jury that he met Mac Wallace and Cliff Carter. Remember, Cliff Carter is the fixer. I've got him pictured here. LBJ's swearing in. He's in the red circle there on board Air Force One. Anyway, they met in Pecos after Henry Marshall was killed. And Wallace is describing for them how it went down. He's saying, I waited for him at his farm and that he had tried to plan it so that it would look like Marshall committed suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning, but Marshall fought him back and he had to hit Marshall over the head and then eventually shoot him with his own rifle. And Carter told him, he said, man, you sure did botch it up. It was a botched job. And so Johnson, because it was botched and messy, was then had to use his influence again to get the authorities to cover it up, for Wallace again. This is the second time now. He's already gotten Wallace off the hook for murder one, even though he was convicted. In the punishment phase, he got him off the hook, got him a job. And now he's doing it again because if you run into any legitimate sheriff or judge or coroner, it's obvious with a bolt action rifle, the man did not commit suicide. It's obvious. Marshall's wife didn't believe what she was being told. She posted a $2,000 reward for any information that would lead to a murder conviction because she didn't believe it was suicide. The Undertaker, Manly Jones, said, quote, to me, it looked like murder. I just do not believe a man could shoot himself like that. Saying the obvious. Raymond Jones, who was Manly's son, told journalist Bill Adler in 1986, quote, Daddy said he told Judge Farmer there's no way Mr. Marshall could have killed himself. Daddy had seen suicides before. JPs depend on us and our judgments about such things. How about judges? We see a lot more deaths than they do. But in this case, Daddy said Judge Farmer told him he was going to put suicide on the death certificate because the sheriff told him to. And so that's what was on the death certificate. Quote, death by gunshot, self-inflicted. Now, this is one of the things that never goes away. Clint Peoples, Texas Ranger, didn't believe Henry Marshall had committed suicide either. And excuse me. In fact, he reported to Colonel Homer Garrison, director of the Texas Department of Public Safety, that it, quote, would have been utterly impossible for Mr. Marshall to have taken his own life. This is Clint Peoples here. Nolan Griffin, who owned a gas station, actually, he was an attendant. He worked at a gas station. And in Robertson County, claimed that on that day, he's telling Clint Peoples this. Peoples is investigating this as well. On the day of Marshall's death, he had been asked by a stranger for directions to Marshall's farm. This is right before Marshall was found dead. So Peoples arranges for a Texas Ranger artist, Thad Johnson, to come and meet with this Nolan Griffin and hatch out a facial sketch based on what he remembered this man looked like. And based on the description given by Nolan Griffin, who sat there and watched him as he drew it, Peoples concluded that this man was Mac Wallace after they did the drawing. This is the drawing. The gas station attendant told Noah Griffin told him, Thad Johnson, he says, he had dark rimmed glasses with dark hair and a scarred dark face. And he'd stopped at the station to ask for directions to Henry Marshall's ranch. This is minutes before the time of Henry Marshall's murder. And he positively identified Wallace when he was shown a picture. After he drew this, and people realized this is Mac Wallace, he showed him a picture of Mac Wallace, and Nolan Griffin positively ID'd him. So we have a murder, a convict, someone who's already been convicted of murder one, uh, positively ID'd by a witness who said that minutes before Henry Marshall died, this man, this murder convict, stopped at his gas station, asked for directions to Henry Marshall's place. I mean, my goodness. And if you compare that picture, there's Mac Wallace on the as you're looking at that picture on the left. You got the dark rimmed glasses, the dark hair, and you can't see it, but he's got a scar on his face. Uh, and here's the artist rendering. So in 1962, Billy Celestis was arrested by the FBI on fraud and conspiracy charges. And look at the date on that. That's a year before the assassination, a year before, but 2 years into JFK or LBJ's time as vice president. Now, this is going to be a problem because it's just inevitable. It's going to get tied back. All of this fraud, all of this conspiracy, this conspiracy to defraud the United States government, the taxpayer. It's going to get tied back to LBJ for sure. And now we have a murder in the investigation of this fraud that can be tied back to LBJ as well. So you can see the crime is getting bigger. It wasn't long before it was disclosed that Henry Marshall had been a key figure in this Billy Celestis investigation. So the Robeson County grand jury ordered the body of Henry Marshall to be exhumed and an autopsy performed because it clearly looks like he had been silenced. And so in the autopsy, they confirmed Marshall had not committed suicide. This is 62. And they found a 15% carbon monoxide concentration in Marshall's body, which is in line with what Mac Wallace told Cliff Carter and LBJ. He was trying to make it look like he died of suicide, death by carbon monoxide. And they found 15% carbon monoxide concentration in his body. So, and the estimate was it could have been as high as 30% time of his death. So you can see this is becoming a bigger problem by the day for LBJ and obviously Billy Celestis. But the one everyone's going to try to protect is not Billy Celestis, it's LBJ. So look what happens in the aftermath. On April 4th, 1962, George Kretelik, pictured here top, who was Estes' chief accountant and was going to be called to testify on matters related to this fraud, was found dead. And he had a severe bruise on his head, just like Henry Marshall had on his head. But the coroner decided, well, he also committed suicide. The very next day, Estes and 3 business associates, which would have included George Kretelik, and the fear was that George Kretelik would flip, he would talk, were indicted by a federal grand jury, 57 counts of fraud. Now you notice who's not included. It's not LBJ. But this is how you get to people like LBJ. It's like an onion. You have to peel the layers and you work your way up. You don't shoot too high too fast because if you miss, you never get another chance. If you're going to kill the king, you gotta kill the king. And it's going to take lots of evidence. It's going to take more than one witness. But as you notice, witnesses are disappearing. Henry Marshall's gone. George Kretelik is now gone. 2 of these 3 business associates who were also indicted on that same day with Estes, Harold Orr and Coleman Wade, also died before the case come to court. And all were ruled suicides, just like Kretelik, just like the original ruling that Henry Marshall died by suicide. Now it's been changed to murder. But since then, Kretelik's died, Harold Orr has died, Coleman Wade's died, all suicides. Now, later, Estes, in one of these grand jury appearances, admits that both men were murdered by Mac Wallace, acting on the orders of LBJ. In fact, uh, one of these witnesses had actually told a Senate subcommittee, and this is right before the assassination of JFK, when they were getting close to nailing LBJ. And of course, JFK was considering dropping him from the ticket. And it's getting really, really close. You can see how things were building here in 62 and why by the time we get to late 63, everything's about ready to come to a head. And that's not even talking about Bobby Baker yet. We're just talking about Billy Saul Estes and all the crimes surrounding Billy Saul Estes. And one of these witnesses told the Senate committee that was looking into LBJ that LBJ was the one getting the quote, rake off from these federal subsidies that Estes had been obtained. So Estes was buying all these cotton allotments, getting all these subsidies not to grow cotton, was growing cotton, getting a double dipping. And then all that subsidy money that was coming in from Washington, he was taking, skimming off the top and giving a portion of it back to LBJ. So they were in business together. And this is what was fixing to come out if JFK does not get assassinated. So we get to 63, and the Senate is really now, it's not just the state of Texas. It's not just the Department of Agriculture. It's now the Senate investigating the case of Billy Saul Estes. And of course, that means they're investigating LBJ. And LBJ is the current vice president. And so at this time, during this year, according to witnesses, including JFK's own secretary, Ms. Lincoln, JFK now began considering dropping LBJ from the ticket in 64. And all kinds of rumors. He needed someone from the South. So there was rumors about Terry Sanford. There were other rumors of other people. Estes Kefauver from Tennessee, other people. Had to be a Southerner. According to author Barr McClellan, one of these inside lawyers, it was decided by Ed Clark. Remember, Ed Clark is LBJ's one of his attorneys, that the investigations, plural, by now, into Billy Saul Estes and Bobby Baker had to be terminated. If LBJ was going to survive as vice president and be on the ticket in 64, these investigations have to go away. Well, we're not even talking about him being president yet. Although the strategy to terminate these investigations is going to involve him becoming president, which means JFK standing in the way. So, according to Barr McClellan, Clark recruited Wallace during this period, 63, to organize the assassination of JFK. Now, remember, we've already learned people like to dismiss Mac Wallace as some simpleton because he's committed murder. He's become basically an assassin. But remember now, we already looked into his bona fides before. He was a legitimate intellectual. You don't go on college campuses, and I'm not talking about local, small two-bit schools. I'm talking about University of North Carolina, University of Texas, Long Island. He's got a PhD, and he's teaching at these places. And this isn't some rube just fell off the turnip truck here. He's become something grotesque, but that doesn't diminish the fact he was brilliant. So you're not going to have guys like Clark and McClellan and Cofer and Clifton Carter, these attorneys that surround and protect, form a buffer around LBJ, their prize bull, so to speak. They're not going to invest in a guy like Mac Wallace if he's a dummy. I mean, it was Ed Clark who brought Mac Wallace to LBJ to begin with. So it's now Ed Clark who's saying, I obviously recognize the potential this guy has, what he's capable of, what he can accomplish. He's the guy that does the dirty work for us. Anyway, Wallace is involved in this assassination plot. And of course, what happens after the assassination, once Johnson becomes president, all of these Senate investigations into Estes and Baker just gone away, just disappeared. And all of his problems legally went away instantly. In that book, which I highly recommend you read, Blood, Money, and Power, McClellan, remember he was that inside attorney, and he worked with Ed Clark and Carter and all those guys. Later claimed that the killing of Kennedy was paid for, here we go, by the oil millionaires, the people that had these sweet 8F guys that had been involved with LBJ in his career from the beginning, pushing, prodding, and nurturing him along, paying for everything he needs, with the ultimate objective that he'd be in the White House someday. So he named them, these oil millionaires, Clint Murchison, Harold Hunt. And he said the guy who masterminded the plot was Ed Clark, and he got $2 million for his work. And there was never a transaction at any bank for $2 million. It was paid to him in the form of an oil well. And that way didn't draw suspicion. And then you look at what happened in the aftermath once the Sweet 8F group got their man in the White House. Remember their original problem with JFK, in addition to all they had problems with LBJ, plural. They didn't like his stance on civil rights. They're very conservative Democrats from the South. They don't like Martin Luther King and the proposed Civil Rights Act that was being proposed by JFK. They didn't like his intervention in the South all these times, down in at Ole Miss and in Alabama and all these different places he had intervened with freedom riders, etc. They hated his civil rights stance. He was a liberal Democrat from the Northeast, and they were conservative Democrats from the South. And they didn't see things the same way. They didn't like his stance on national security, and they thought he was soft on communism. I could go into a million reasons. We talked about H.L. Hunt, how conservative he was. He hated communists, and they literally thought JFK was a communist. He was selling the nation down the road to the communists, to Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviets. But when you really get down to it, push comes to shove, it's about their own financial interests. Remember, ultra vires, it's about the benefit to me. And it was going to cost them money if JFK stayed in office. He was trying to reduce or to completely do away with the oil depletion allowance. He was trying to pass the Kennedy Act, which would lower the amount of money you could hide in offshore bank accounts away from taxes. It was going to, all of this was going to cost, you take the two together, about the oil industry, about $300 million per year going forward if he got his way. And so Johnson keeps the oil depletion allowance at 27.5%. And the Kennedy Act goes away. Now, soon after Johnson leaves office in 68, Nixon comes into power. That oil depletion allowance was cut almost in half. But they bought themselves at least 5 years with Johnson. And if you do the math on that, 300 million a year times five, it's a lot of money. So, so what happened with Billy Solestis? I told you the poor man. I don't know if you call him a poor man, but death was merciful to LBJ. He died early on, and all his problems sort of went away. But Billy Solestis lived a long time, and the problems never did go away. And a 1984 letter from Estes' lawyer, Douglas Caddy, to Stephen S. Trott, they're trying to make a deal. We get to 84, and they're still after him. So, all of this has happened in 60, 61, 62. And 84, you're 24, 25 years later, they're still after him. And so he's exhausted. He's been in front of countless grand juries. And so he authorizes his attorney to write a letter to the Department of Justice. And he authorized, hoping for some leniency, Caddy to disclose the following. All right, you've been asking me for years for information. I've hung on to it, and I have not given you what you wanted for all these years, which is probably why you're still after me. But now LBJ's been long gone. So here's the deal. Mr. Estes was a member of a 4-member group headed by Lyndon Johnson, which committed criminal acts in Texas in the 1960s. He's admitting. He says the other two conspirators, besides myself and LBJ, were Cliff Carter, the fixer, and Mac Wallace, the hitman. So you know where this is going. According to Estes, through his lawyer who was writing this letter to the Department of Justice. He says, Mr. Estes is willing to disclose his knowledge concerning the following criminal murders related to his case. Now, these are only related to him. There might be more, okay, unrelated to me in particular that I'm not aware of, but these are the ones I know of. The killing of Henry Marshall, the killing of George Kretelik, the killing of Ike Rogers and his secretary, Coleman Wade, the killing of Josepha Johnson, LBJ's own sister, pictured here, the killing of John Kinzer, and the killing of President John F. Kennedy. Hard to find information on Ike Rogers and his secretary, but the other ones, Coleman Wade and George Kretelik, these were two that were going to be, that were involved with all the Billy Saul Estes dealings and his business dealings with LBJ, etc. They were indicted and going to have to testify, so they were taken out. Josepha Johnson became an embarrassment to LBJ as he rose higher. And even after the death of John Kinzer, who was trying to extort him, Josepha still had blackmail compromise on her brother. And once LBJ realized that the real problem was Josepha, she had to be taken out as well. His own sister. Of course, Henry Marshall was the investigator. And of course, the killing of JFK made all of this go away because now he's president. So the similarities of all these killings, which links them together because they all involved blows to their heads and carbon monoxide poisoning, and including Josepha. They were all ruled suicides and no autopsy, including Josepha. And we've already learned that that was the modus operandi for Mac Wallace, to make like someone was committing suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. And if they fought, he would beat them on the head, probably with the butt of a gun or a pistol, whatever, leave a big bruise on their head, and then introduce the carbon monoxide into their system. Of course, none of them were suicides; they were all homicides, but they all had similarities. According to Estes, now this is where I dispute some of the, and Estes may not have been privy to all the inner workings and where people ended up in Dallas on November 22nd, but he says Mac Wallace was a stone killer with a communist background. He had recruited Jack Ruby, who in turn recruited Lee Harvey Oswald. Not sure about all that. I don't know about his recruitment of Ruby. Ruby was, as we have already learned, mobbed up to the hilt. He was already involved in all this stuff. And Oswald was CIA. He was, but I wouldn't dispute the fact that they all worked together. They're all part of the same plot. Obviously. According to Estes, Cliff Carter told him that Mac Wallace fired a shot from the grass. You know, if you look on that picture, there's a red circle where this is one of the Mary Mormon photographs, famous photographs. And that's sort of the place where they said Mac Wallace was. Shot from the grassy knoll in Dallas, which hit JFK in front during the assassination. We know that he was not there because we know where he was. We're going to get to that in just a second. But we know someone was there, but it wasn't Mac Wallace. So not everything that Estes said in that letter to the Department of Justice was 100% accurate as to the details, like where Mac Wallace was or who he recruited into the plot. But the major points are right on point, that all of those people did not die by suicide. They were involved. They were murdered. And he had personal knowledge of them being murdered. And that Mac Wallace was the hitman who carried them out. And that includes what happened in Dallas. Now, regarding where Mac Wallace was, on November 22nd. After the assassination, there was a fingerprint. Remember, the FBI, Dallas police are all looking for fingerprints. They're looking for fingerprints on the gun, so-called assassination rifle. Never found any until after Oswald died, when they made a secret visit to the mortuary. Uh, Looking for fingerprints in the sniper's nest, looking for fingerprints. They want Oswald's fingerprints, and they never found any. Uh, they've now. It's interesting about the sniper's nest. There were a couple of Oswald prints on boxes that were used to construct the sniper's nest, but a defense attorney would be able to negotiate around that pretty easily because that's where he worked. That was his workstation, handling boxes. But who didn't work there and had no reason to be there was Mac Wallace. And they found a 34-point match. Mac Wallace matched fingerprint on one of these boxes in the sniper's nest. Now, 34-point, I include this because it only takes 10 to 12-point match for it to be considered conclusive in a U.S. court. This was a 34-point match. Nathan Darby, who's the most experienced Latin print examiner in America in 1963, looked at this print. He had 35 years of military forensic and police experience. And he said, quote, I'm positive the finger that made the ink print also made the latent print. It's a match. And what they did is they took an ink print from Wallace and they compared it to the latent print, and he said, it's a match. It's the same guy. In other words, Mac Wallace was in the sniper's nest. And there's the picture of the prints and the sniper's nest. According to Madeline Brown, we've talked about her before. She was his mistress. She said Wallace was Lyndon's hatchet man. And after LBJ's lawyer, John Cofer, got Wallace off on a suspended sentence after the 52 murder conviction, he became literally owing his life to LBJ. He became their little cleanup man. He handled their problems. So you had the inner circle, the Suite AF circle, right? You had the LBJ and you had the lawyers and all those other folks who made up Suite AF. And then when problems arose that threatened LBJ, Wallace was called on. And according to Billy Saul Estes, before he killed JFK or was involved in the assassination of JFK, he had already killed 7 other people for LBJ on his rise to power. Remember now, ultra vires. Doesn't matter what public interest is. It's all about profit or benefit to me. And then you immunize yourself so you never face consequences. And this is what LBJ, that's how he's been operating, it turns out, his entire political career. The latent fingerprint found on one of the cardboard boxes in the Texas School Book Depository sniper's nest matched an ink print of Wallace. And so we now know that it was Wallace. There's more evidence that Wallace was in the sniper's nest than Lee Harvey Oswald. We now know, as far as motive is concerned, when you're trying to solve crimes, you look for motive, means, opportunity. The Kennedy plan to dump LBJ from the ticket, according to Evelyn Lincoln, the White House secretary, the personal secretary for JFK. He told her before he went to Dallas, quote, I am going to Texas because I have made a commitment. I can't patch up those warring factions. This is for them to do, but I will go because I have told them that I would. And if it's too early to make an announcement about another running mate, that will perhaps wait until the convention. So he's talking about another running mate and that it's going to happen at least, if not now, at the convention. And when she asked him about who he was thinking about, he replied, quote, at this time, I am thinking about Governor Terry Sanford of North Carolina, but it will not be Lyndon. There was that famous news article in the Dallas paper the day before the assassination, and where they interviewed Richard Nixon, who was in town for the Pepsi-Cola convention. And in the interview, Nixon predicted that JFK was going to drop Johnson. So this was not a big secret. And Of course, what JFK was trying to set up and what folks that were opposed to JFK, like these sweet AF people, like the CIA, like the Pentagon, all these deep state forces that we've discussed, are looking at what JFK's setting up, and they're not stupid. They see this Kennedy dynasty coming. They see JFK winning re-election in 64, serving till 68. That's 8 years. They see RFK primed and ready to run in 68. If he wins, he'll probably win a second term. That's another 8 years. And they see younger brother Teddy in the wings. Uh, by the time RFK gets out in 76, he'll be old enough to run. And that's another 8 years. We could have 24 years straight of Kennedys. And of course, a lot of these deep state conspirators that we are focusing on hated RFK more than they hated JFK. So it's not any consolation to them that JFK would be out of office in 68, and because RFK's worse. Teddy's kind of a open, he's a blank, nobody knows anything about him yet. But so this is a real threat, this Kennedy bench that they have, this dynasty that they're preparing. And of course, if you know history, you know that RFK did run in 68 and would have won had he not also been assassinated. And Teddy did run in 76, lost the primary to Jimmy Carter, but probably if it hadn't been for Chappaquiddick, maybe he wins that primary and then he wins. So they weren't wrong. So it looked like LBJ's chances of becoming president, if JFK was not taken out before he had a chance to win re-election in 64, there was no opportunity there. If you look at that going forward, there's no opportunity for LBJ to sneak in. He was never going to be president unless something dramatic happened. That's the political side. There's also a legal side. These federal investigations are getting close to a point where LBJ is going to be indicted. And of course, that'll be the pretext to drop him from the ticket. On November 22nd, 1960, the very day JFK was assassinated, there was testimony and paperwork provided by Don Reynolds, who was appearing before a Senate Rules Committee to testify that LBJ had demanded kickbacks in return for him agreeing to a life insurance policy all the way back in 1957. And he had the documents. And also Reynolds was prepared to testify that he'd seen a suitcase full of money, which Bobby Baker, LBJ's personal bagman in the Senate, described as a, quote, $100,000 payoff to Johnson for his role in securing the Fort Worth TFX contract. That's a contract with General Dynamics that LBJ steered to General Dynamics in exchange for this $100,000 payoff. These are bribes. This is what Reynolds is testifying on this is why LBJ was on the phone all morning with Washington getting updates on this testimony. Phil Brennan, an article in Newsmax 2003, he was an author writing for National Review under the pseudonym Cato. Quote, a few days later, the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, called 5 of Washington's top reporters into his office and told them it was now open season on Lyndon Johnson. It's okay, he told them, to go after the story they were ignoring out of deference to the administration. In other words, there was a point in the first term of JFK where for a long time, everybody was aware of the corruption of LBJ, but they stayed away from it so as not to hurt JFK. But there was a point at which the Attorney General called top reporters and said, go after him. This is after he and JFK have made the decision to drop him from the ticket. He's now open, free, fair game. That's according to Phil Brennan. And Seymour Hersh, in his pretty extensive reporting on the JFK administration, said that Bobby had an RFK destroy LBJ plan. RFK destroy LBJ plan. So this is what's dogging LBJ. He knows not only is he politically dead meat, legally, he's going to be indicted. And there's so much corruption that goes back to his days in Texas and throughout his time as congressman and senator. There's so much corruption. He don't stand a chance if this makes it into the legal system, into the court system. Bobby Kennedy, acting attorney general, was only weeks away from indicting LBJ. And of course, we've already learned that was going to be the pretext uh, under which JFK and Bobby decided to dump him the ticket. In other words, LBJ's life was over. His political career was over. He's probably going to serve out the rest of his life in prison. He would be just humiliated. And all the salad days of making all this money through these rackets, the Sweet AF group, their golden child. There are a lot of people that were invested in LBJ, not just LBJ himself, who saw this as a threat to not just LBJ, but to them and their interests. From a personal standpoint, LBJ hated the Kennedys. A lot of the Kennedy staffers referred to LBJ derisively as, quote, Uncle Corn Pone. They laughed at him. And so that sort of sheds some light on LBJ's statement, alleged statement to Madeline Brown that night at Clint Murchison's estate when he comes out of that meeting with all those sweet 8Fers and tells her, these Kennedy sons of bitches will never embarrass me again. That's not a threat. That's a promise. He was angry. He was mad. And there was a lot of anger, a lot of hostility there, bitterness towards the Kennedys, jealous, envy. He thought it should have been him on that ticket in '60, the top of the ticket. Remember, H.L. Hunt went out to California, negotiated with Joe Kennedy, and got outfoxed. But he said, I'll just bide my time, not realizing that they were going to double cross him the way that Kennedys pretty much double cross everybody. So Drew Pearson was the most influential political columnist of the day. On November 24th, 2 days after the assassination, he submits a column for publication, nailing LBJ for taking bribes from General Dynamics. In other words, he is essentially writing the column that Don Reynolds testified to 2 days prior in the Senate. But before it could be published, he withdrew the article because now LBJ is the president. He's the king. Life magazine was about to do an expose. They'd been working on this article, and it was going to reveal a timeline and just all the different corrupt activities Johnson been involved in, from Billy Celestis to Bobby Baker, General Dynamics to all the others. And it wasn't necessarily an expose on the murders, because at that time, that'd be shooting too high, but that probably would have ended up there at some point. If you can convict him on these other things, then it stands to reason. It just flows from that these people who died probably were taken out because of the incriminating information they had about LBJ. Anyway, according to James Wagenvord, who was the editorial business manager and assistant to Life magazine's executive editor, big mouthful of a title there, quote, beginning in later summer 1963, the magazine, based upon information fed from Bobby Kennedy, so this is the Attorney General, head of the Department of Justice. This is why we know this indictment was coming. And the Justice Department had been developing a major news break piece concerning Johnson and Bobby Baker. On publication, Johnson would have been finished and off the 64 ticket, which was the reason the material was fed to us by Bobby, and would have probably have been facing prison time. But going again to the motive that LBJ had to take out JFK after Dallas, with him now as president, Life magazine decided not to use, just like Drew Pearson pulled his story. Life magazine decided not to use their story. According to Wagenvord, quote, the LBJ Baker piece was in the final editing stages, and was scheduled to break in the issue of the magazine due out the week of November 24th. LBJ was out of time, literally. The magazine would have made it to the newsstands on November 26th or 7th. It had been prepared in relative secrecy by a small special editorial team. On Kennedy's death, research files and all numbered copies of the nearly print-ready draft were gathered up by my boss and shredded. The issue that was supposed to expose LBJ instead featured the Zapruder film, which transposed the critical frames to make it look like JFK was shot from behind, setting up Lee Harvey Oswald. Remember, immunity. That's the crucial part or element of ultravires. You screw the public to benefit yourself, to profit, to increase your profits, and then you rig the immunity process so that you never pay the price for it. You never face any consequences for it. So here is how LBJ is going to get away with all this. He's going to get away with it by becoming president. All these investigations, all these stories, all these negative press, it's all going away. And in its place will be a Life magazine devoted to nailing the patsy. After word of the assassination of JFK reached Washington, the Senate investigation was delayed and then eventually dropped. So this is the motive. Killing JFK. Remember, Ed Clark, his attorney, said, okay, that we've got to, in 63, he made the decision, according to Billy Celeste, we have got to tie off these investigations. We can't let it, too much is at stake. And in 63, with the death of JFK, all the investigations are dropped. All the negative press goes away. The threat of not being on the ticket in 64 no longer it's a moot point. The question is, did LBJ have the means and opportunity? And when I say LBJ, I'm talking about LBJ et al. I'm talking about all the people that were in his orbit, that were part of his cabal. Well, we already know from two witnesses that on November 21st, 1963, LBJ was at a meeting, came late to a party, and they had a meeting. And if you want to know the full story on May Newman and Madeline Brown, previous episodes about LBJ, you can check that out. But we know from their testimony that he was there, and that after that meeting, he came out and issued that threat to JFK twice to Madeline Brown, and then called her the next morning and issued it again. This is the story of that meeting. Brown says about 11 o'clock, he came in, they went to this meeting, and he says, after tomorrow, those Kennedy sons of bitches will never embarrass me again. That's no threat, that's a promise. And then he telephoned her the next day. We know that these people were at this meeting. This is the same, basically take the Suite 8F group roster and photocopy it, because this is almost the same people. LBJ, Governor Connolly, J. Edgar Hoover, Nixon. Nixon wasn't in the Suite 8F group, but he was a future president. Mob bosses like Carlos Marcello, Joe Zavala, his lawyers, Cliff Carter, John McCloy, big money man, Charles Cabal, former CIA, his brother Earl Cabal, mayor of Dallas, big oil guys, H.O. Hunt, John Currington. They never went anywhere separately. Currington was his attorney. Clint Murchison, big oil guy. George Brown, Brown and Root. Of course, that was Clint Murchison's house too. Brown and Root Construction. Jack Ruby, one of the useful instruments. Malcolm Mac Wallace was there, useful instrument. Clint Peoples was there. Bill Decker. You got local. Everybody's there. Look at the deep state representation. You got the DC is represented by LBJ and Nixon. You got state of Texas represented by Connolly. You got Dallas represented by the mayor. FBI is represented by Hoover. State and local law enforcement, Peoples and Decker. You got organized crime there, which is handy for the disposal of Oswald later. You got CIA, both Cabal brothers. You got big business, all the big oil people, Brown Root Construction, and of course LBJ's personal. Remember, there was a four-person team according to Bill Saul Estes. The only one that wasn't there that night was Billy Saul Estes. Cliff Carter was on that four-person team. LBJ was on that four-person team. Mac Wallace was on that. All three of those guys were there. The only one not in that four-person group that Billy Saul Estes said was responsible for all those murders up to and including JFK was Billy Saul Estes. Everybody else was there. And of course, afterwards, when she put two and two together and suspected that LBJ was involved in the assassination, she confronted him. She said, Lennon, you got to tell me, you got to talk to me. Were you involved with Kennedy's death? He says, you know the people I know, the oil people in the CIA, they did it. So that is another means, an opportunity example. How about this is why LBJ was so necessary. To all the people out there say LBJ had a minimal role, if any. My God, he controlled everything. He controlled the, if you want to call it the field of operations, which is Dallas. He controlled it. Texas. He controlled it. John Connally was his best friend. He was his handpicked guy to be governor. And Connally was put in charge of the Texas trip. He's part of the reason why they went to Texas. He's part of the arrangements that were made with the Secret Service, the fact choosing of the cities that he would go to. Connally was intricately involved in all that. Of course, if Connally's involved, that means LBJ's involved. They're like two heads of the same coin. Secret Service, turns out Raleigh and LBJ are close friends. And so you get into and we'll get into this next, the role that the Secret Service played in Dallas, another sort of deep state operator that was not allegiant to the president, as it turns out, was allegiant to LBJ during this whole thing in Dallas because of the friendship that the director of the Secret Service, Raleigh, had with LBJ. And of course, the Secret Service was involved in many things, not just the trip itself, but the post-assassination cover-up, like what to do with JFK's body. It was the Secret Service that stole his body. What to do with certain evidence. It was the Secret Service that suppressed a lot of evidence or forced witnesses to change their testimony, like doctors, which put him on that plane, sent him to Washington so they could get a rigged autopsy, right? None of that happens if you don't have the complicity of the Secret Service. Governor Connally was involved in choosing the trademark as his destination instead of the women's building. Women's building was what the Kennedy team wanted. It was defendable, small, just a couple entrances. The trademark was many entrances and undefendable. If they didn't get him at Dealey, they were going to get him at the trademark. It was Connally. Who changed the motorcade route to life? It was Earl Cabal, the mayor, working in conjunction with the Secret Service. Bill Moyers got the bubble top removed. Bill Moyers was an LBJ guy. Dry Holes Bird will use the Texas School Book Depository building. Who owns it? One of the Suite 8F guys, Dry Holes Bird. As far as the mechanics are concerned, if you listen to the testimony of Billy Saul Estes, Mac Wallace, Ruby, Oswald, all involved, and we know to what extent they were involved and what their roles were, we know that they were all involved. The government says Oswald did it. I don't believe that for a second, but he was involved. He knew it was coming, and he tried to warn, for example, the FBI about what happened in Chicago and fixing to happen in Dallas. So he knew. And he was in various places where the planning and stuff was taking place. Lots of evidence to show that he was trying to prevent it. Jack Ruby, we know his involvement. Mac Wallace, we know his involvement. The Dallas County Sheriff's Department. If you don't have Dallas Police and Dallas County Sheriff's Department, we know Sheriff's Department was represented at that party the night before. So was Dallas Police. We know that they manufactured, suppressed so much evidence, all in the direction of incriminating Oswald and immunizing the real conspirators, the real perpetrators. And of course, all of these guys are under the control of LBJ because he controls all of Texas. He controls the governor, he controls the judges, he controls local, state and local law enforcement. He's got, they're all under his thumb. And the mayor of Dallas is at the party in the meeting with all the conspirators the night before the assassination. It's all fixed, it's all rigged. And of course, J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover is one of the, he was one of the guys in Suite 8F. He's one of the guys at the party. He's best friends with LBJ. He runs the FBI, and he's the guy that first came out and said that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Put the stamp, the director of the FBI on it. And before an investigation had even begun, the patsy's already been named. And of course, we now know, had all kinds of advanced knowledge from Lee about a plot in Chicago. We now know that Richard Case Nagel had written him a letter telling him about a plot to set Lee Harvey Oswald up as the patsy. We know he was at the meeting, Murchison House. So all of these, what's the common denominator with all these? It's the relationship with LBJ. It's the fact that they're all under his thumb. And then after the assassination, look how his control extends out past Dallas and past Texas. Now he's controlling all of Washington. He is the new president on Air Force One. He gets sworn in, even though it's not necessary. All the optics of that, and he begins parroting immediately the lone gunman narrative. So you got the FBI director stating it, you got the new president stating it. American people are lapping it up. The media, Life magazine, prints the edition that was supposed to nail LBJ to the wall. Instead, it nails the patsy to the wall, furthering the lone nut narrative. Then, he's part of the decision-making process to get the president's autopsy done not in Texas, but in Washington under the thumb of military doctors, medical examiners who had never done a gunshot autopsy, which furthers the lone gunman evidence, the physical evidence part of it. And then the FBI investigation. We've already talked about his relationship with J. Edgar Hoover, and all the forensics and ballistic evidence is going to be steered in one direction. All of this is going to be steered. The autopsy, the FBI, everything is steered towards the lone gunman narrative. And the CIA, which is now, he's the president of the United States. It reports to the executive branch. And its model or its narrative is going to be that this is Oswald was a Marxist, Leninist, Castro revolutionary. They invent this Mexico City legend about him going to Mexico City, trying to arrange a trip to Cuba, meeting with a Russian assassination expert, Kostakov, coming back, assassinating the president, trying to escape to Cuba. It was all made up. Even J. Edgar Hoover knew it was made up, and flat told LBJ that it was made up. It doesn't matter. It's what was being put out in the news at the moment, and it created this narrative around Lee Harvey Oswald, this overwhelming narrative. The guy had been to Russia. He was a communist. It was all kind. So all of these guys are working together in concert to create this unstoppable momentum in the direction of a lone gunman. And it's LBJ who presides over the state funeral, which American people get so focused on, and under the during the same time that the state funeral is taking place, Ruby takes out Oswald on that Sunday down in Dallas. So the diversion was the state funeral with all the trappings, right? The riderless horse and backwards boots and the big parade and the cathedral and Jackie and the kids. Oh my God. JFK's body in state, lying in state. And then boom, Jack Ruby sneaks. Oh, also in the news today, Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Takes out the patsy. JFK movie, Oliver Stone, whoever wrote this, they said it best. He says, quote, the glitter of official lies and the epic splendor of the thought-numbing funeral of JFK confuse the eye and confound the understanding. That's what it was. It's a big show. And who's over the show? It's LBJ. He's now in charge. And then who appoints the commission? This is the ultimate end of ultra vires. Immunize yourself so nobody in the plot ever faces consequences. You handpick the Warren Commission. You handpick the commissioners. You start with a conclusion, work backwards, and fill in all the blanks so that you end up with this lone gunman narrative now becoming official. It becomes history. Richard Nixon said the Warren Commission is the biggest goddamn hoax in American history. Who was over that? Who picked all those guys? It was LBJ. So look at some of these patterns. There's a list of, according to Billy Celestis, these are the, and look at the dates on John Kinzer was sort of the outlier in the sense that it was 10 years before the next event. But then you get them right in a row. Henry Marshall is 61, Josephus 61, Kurtillik 62, Wade 62, Orr 63, JFK 60. This was all related to the JFK, to the Billy Celestis investigations, and later Bobby Baker, and all in an effort to preserve LBJ, the meal ticket at the top of the Suite 8F criminal cartel, if you want to call it that. And the synchronicities, all the motives are the same: to cover up LBJ's role in criminal racketeering and other crimes, and to further his political career, not just for his own benefit, but for theirs as well. The means he had at his disposal were these attorneys that worked for him: Ed Clark, Cofer, Carter. The hitman that he had at his disposal, all the cash he needed from big oil, and the immunity that he gained from control over state and local, and eventually federal, the federal government. His control over the coroner's offices, state and local, like the autopsy at Bethesda, the judges. He controlled everything. He is the necessary component for the deep state to get away with this. And of course, he is the common denominator in all these victims. So he has plenty of opportunity. He is the key component. For the deep state, he becomes the most useful instrument. He's not the planner. He's not the shooter. But he is the most useful instrument to make sure it happens, to arrange where it happens, and to get away with it afterwards. To pay for it, I mean, there is no one more useful in this whole shebang than LBJ. On the plane afterwards, you see the picture of Congressman Albert Thomas there in the back of the plane. LBJ is turning to him, a very famous photograph. Thomas was a protege of LBJ, and he was voted in the House in 36. In 49, he became chairman of the House Defense Appropriations Committee. This is an important guy in the national security apparatus. He was part of the Suite 8F group operating out of the Lamar Hotel in Houston. We've talked exhaustive. So this is an LBJ crony. And here he is, captured by photograph. And it wasn't supposed to be, but this is right after LBJ took the oath. He turns, looks. Yeah, Jackie's still standing there. You can tell she's just overwhelmed with grief. Lady Bird's happy as a clam. I don't understand that lady. And then LBJ turns to Albert Thomas, and Albert Thomas gives him a quick wink. And the photographer caught it. It's like they knew something. And this is the culmination of everything the Suite 8F group was working towards all these years. And it has just been accomplished. Of course, also in this photograph, if I widened it out, was LBJ's fixer in the back, attorney Cliff Carter. LBJ, an interesting story from Brigadier General Godfrey McHugh, who had been at JFK's side all his trips. He was an Air Force One pilot in 1963. Actually, he wasn't. These are the Air Force One pilots in 1963. But he was the guy that was supposed to be in the front middle seat of the limo. He always rode in the front middle seat of the limo that they took out and moved to the back of the motorcade so as to open up the field of fire right to the middle of that front windshield. He was with JFK always on Air Force One, all his trips. And he tells a story that after the assassination, they're all getting ready to leave on Air Force One. They're waiting for the new president to order, the plane's sitting there idling the engines, and they need permission from the new president to take off. And they can't find him. So Godfrey McHugh goes searching for him. He finally finds him in the back in the presidential bedroom, where he's not in on the bed or in the bedroom itself, but there's a little off room, a room off to the side where the bathroom is, and he hears a noise. He goes in there, and LBJ, according to Godfrey McHugh, is in the fetal position in the shower, rocking back and forth, saying, "They're going to get us all. They're going to get us all. It's a plot. It's a plot." And he's crying. He's inconsolable. And Godfrey McHugh has to get him off on his feet, get him, restore his composure, and say, "Listen, you've got to go up there and order these pilots to take off, but no one's going to take off till you give the word." And that's his testimony in the aftermath of the assassination. LBJ had a moment where he lost his composure. And in that moment, observed by Godfrey McHugh, it looks like Johnson knew the inner workings of the plot and was afraid. That old expression, live by the sword, die by the sword. He's already committed all these murders to help himself. Now a murder has been committed to help him and to help himself. And it's almost like the weight of that is just hit him all at once, realized what he's become and how he could end up being a victim of the same kind of plot himself. Now you make of it what you want, but years later, after Watergate, E. Howard Hunt, who had been long suspected, been involved as a CIA guy, and he was in the shadows in the CIA, involved in all the anti-Cuba stuff, anti-Castro stuff for years. But then once Watergate happened, he got arrested. And he had to go to trial. All of it came out, and people started to suspect that he'd been in Dallas the day JFK was killed, and he even, uh, you know, sued like this publication who named him as part of the plot. And initially he won, but then later on appeal he lost because the evidence from Marina Lorenz showed conclusively that he was in Dallas and he had been involved in the plot. And the jury foreperson came out and said so afterwards. And it was a civil trial. It wasn't a criminal trial, but in the civil trial came out and said, "We believe the jury that the CIA and E. Howard Hunt killed President Kennedy." And obviously, E. Howard Hunt denied it. But right before he died, he gave a deathbed confession to his son and to writer Eric Hamburg in 2004. He admitted, "I was there. I was a bench warmer. I wasn't one of the players. I was a backup." And he called it the big event, which was the JFK assassination. And some people in the photographs of the tramps always thought that E. Howard Hunt was one of the tramps, the tramp C, they call it. He wasn't. He wasn't one of the tramps. That was the particular one they thought was E. Howard Hunt turned out to be Chauncey Holt. But nevertheless, he was in Dallas by his own admission and by Marina Lorenz's testimony and by several other corroborating witnesses. He was there. And A. Howard Hunt on his deathbed wrote out a flow chart how the assassination hierarchy for the plot went. He put LBJ at the top. Cord Meyer, who was picked by the CIA to kind of handle all the workings of the plot. This guy was an officer. He and Bill Harvey were over the plot. Bill Harvey, there's never been an assassination carried out by the CIA that Bill Harvey wasn't involved in, right? During the time that he was alive. He was the assassination expert. So according to E. Howard Hunt, it was LBJ, it was Cord Meyer, Bill Harvey, and then he named an assassin, David Morales, who I suspect was in the Deltex building with James Braden. And then he said on the grassy knoll, There was a French gunman on the grassy knoll. Um, so that's now we're now up to two people that people say were on the grassy knoll. Billy Celestis said it was Mac Wallace. E. Howard Hunt said it was the French gunman. Um, it's kind of interesting uh, how much disinformation you have to weed through when you're investigating or researching this affair. And I don't think it really matters in the big picture who was on the grassy knoll, other than to say that if it was somebody in the CIA, then it was clearly the CIA that was behind it. You look at who they were representing. But later on, you'll have James Files will come out and say he was on the grassy knoll, Roscoe White. So that's a whole other set of encyclopedias. But bottom line is what you have from E. Howard Hunt is that LBJ was at the top of the plot. He was the most useful instrument. And he used the word maniacal. E. Howard Hunt said LBJ was the maniacal who was the one responsible for the plot in Dallas. And uh, these other guys were operators within the CIA itself. Cord Meyer was CIA, Bill Harvey was CIA, David Morales was CIA. They were all CIA guys. So you see how you have a blend. It's almost like a Venn diagram. You have these these deep state operators like Lee Harvey, like LBJ and the Sweet AF, mixing with national security apparatus like CIA, Pentagon, and that's how these things get carried out. Um, and then on his deathbed, Leo Janos came. He was a speechwriter, friend at LBJ. Here you see a picture of LBJ. Never really did expect to live long. He had serious heart problems himself. It was in his family. It's hereditary. In the Atlantic Monthly magazine, 1973, Leo Janis, who was at that time writing for Time magazine, he was a correspondent and a freelance nonfiction writer, went to Johnson City and interviewed his friend for a pretty lengthy time and got him to open up about the JFK assassination and told Janos, quote, I always believed there was a conspiracy. This is the guy who appointed the Warren Commission. And famously, they handed it to him, and that became the official narrative. He's saying, I always believed there was a conspiracy. And he said, although Oswald may have pulled the trigger, or pulled a trigger, he wasn't the only one. And it says, quote, we have been running a goddamn murder incorporated in the government. And who should know better than LBJ about murder? Minutes before the assassination, it's just a little anecdote. LBJ tried to get his friend Connolly to switch cars. And he wanted him to ride with him in the VP's car and put his enemy, Ralph Yarborough, in the car with JFK, which he called the death car. That's interesting to me that LBJ and Connolly were best friends, and yet John Connolly, who obviously knew the plot, or maybe didn't, maybe LBJ kept, these need to know issues. Maybe Connolly was aware of what his role was, which was to get Kennedy to come to Dallas, come to Texas, and help with the arrangements. But maybe it speaks to him not being aware that he wanted to be in the quote death car with JFK. And of course, we know he got shot too. And Connolly's testimony disputed or contradicted the lone gun narrative because he always claimed that the magic bullet was impossible. He was shot by a separate bullet from the one that hit JFK in the back, which would have blown the whole lone gunman narrative to bits. His wife didn't believe it either. So I am of the mind that Connolly was unaware. He was on a need to know basis. He was aware of his part in what we would call the plot. He didn't realize it was a plot, but he was aware of his role in JFK's trip and where he would speak later at the Trade Martins to the Women's Building, the route of the motorcade, et cetera, et cetera. But as far as the shooting was taking place, he you'd think from a self-preservation standpoint, if he knew, he'd be very amenable to the idea of riding in two cars back with LBJ. So, but LBJ knew, which is why he tried to get JFK to put Connolly in the car behind him, and JFK wouldn't hear of it. So now that he is president, 99 minutes after the assassination, here he is taking the oath. There you see Albert Thomas leaning in right before they turn and look at each other and wink. And now that his dream of becoming president is realized and his legal problems are gone, now it's time for him to pony up, deliver, and it's time to cover up. So in the pony up, on interestingly, on November 21st, 1963, the day before the assassination, the National Security Action Memo 273 is drafted. And I have here by Robert McNamara. It's actually drafted by, what was his name? Um, the same guy who drafted National Security Action Memo 263. And I can't remember his name. It'll come to me. But it wasn't Robert McNamara. Anyway, this is the same, you know, National Security Action Memo 263 had been drafted and signed by JFK a month earlier, which is a withdrawal from Vietnam. And now they're drafting a memo 1 month later. And if JFK is supposed to live beyond November 22nd, they're going to be asking the same president who signed for a withdrawal to sign a new memo, reversing himself and calling for expansion of the Vietnam policy. It doesn't even make sense. The fact that it was drafted on November 21st, 1963, speaks to knowledge internally by people close to the president. He was not going to be the one signing this new document. He was going to be LBJ. And so, sure enough, 2 days after JFK's funeral, National Security Action Memo 273 reverses National Security Action Memo 263. LBJ's policy calls for an expansion of CIA activity in Vietnam, which led to the Gulf of Tonkin, which led to the Vietnam War. And of course, all these deep staters, that's what they wanted. They wanted a Vietnam War. JFK was against it. So LBJ, once JFK was taken out, reversed it and gave them, this is the pony up part of it, he gave them what they wanted, which was this war. All those people back home in Texas, General Dynamics, Bell Helicopter, Brown and Root Construction, the builders of Vietnam, the big oil people, Hunt, Murchison, Sid Richardson, the CIA, the Pentagon, the deep state wanted this war, and LBJ gave it to them. And of course, if you know the chronology of it, that led to August 4th, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin. 3 days later, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which will authorize CIA counterintelligence operations in Vietnam. The war never did get an authorization by Congress. It was just this Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which essentially was the Vietnam War, this joint resolution. And we now know the Gulf of Tonkin incident never happened. It was a fabrication. It's one of these false flags to get us in a war. In a long line of false flags, dating back to the USS Maine, dating back to the that got us in the Spanish-American War, dating back to the Lusitania, which got us in World War One, Pearl Harbor got us in World War Two. Now Gulf of Tonkin gets us in Vietnam. And of course, we know the Vietnam War was a CIA war. And you remember the big oil people so scared about the 27.5% oil depletion allowance being reduced. He renews the 27.5% oil depletion allowance. And so right there in just those two things, those two acts, and there were many more, but there's just those two, he gives the cabal, this treasonous cabal, exactly what they wanted. Oil profits remain the same. And now profits, because war is more profitable than peace, are going to go up. because now we get the Vietnam War, and JFK would not have given us the Vietnam War. Now comes the issue of covering up the immunity. LBJ is the president, so he appoints the Warren Commission on February 17, 1964. It's a blue ribbon commission. He twists several people's arms to get on it, most notably uh, Chief Justice Earl Warren to give it credibility. The guy who really ran this committee is pictured second from the right, Alan Dulles, former director of the CIA. When LBJ announced this commission, he said this is intended to, quote, investigate all aspects of the assassination and produce an official report that would satisfy the American people. But really, it was to avoid any parallel investigations by bodies that weren't under his control that might come to a separate conclusion. And you see what happened immediately. This is when you know the fix is in, um, by how they create these commissions. The rules, no publicity, everything's secret, no transcripts, press, no press. And then you look at the makeup. These are not Kennedy people. Obviously Republicans. Then you have two Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats hated the Northeastern liberal Kennedy. You have intel and military represented, and you have a token. He's the public face, and that's Earl Warren. Look at who these people are. Um, all of them with military background. Warren was U.S. Army, Russell was U.S. Navy, Cooper was Army, Boggs Navy, Ford Navy, Dulles CIA, McCloy U.S. Army. This is a deep state commission investigating the deep state, which is really means it's just a cover up. And it was a compromised investigation from the get-go. Started with a conclusion. This is going to end up on Lee Harvey Oswald's doorstep. And our job is to make sure any and all evidence that contradicts that disappears. You look at some of these guys, John McCloy, you talk about a piece of work. He was the Secretary of War who said, when Alan Dulles was presented 3 different times with hard evidence what was going on at Auschwitz, it was McCloy acting on Dulles's recommendations, who opposed bombing the rail lines that fed Auschwitz. That's all it would have taken. We could have shut Auschwitz down, just bomb the rail lines. The Germans didn't have any control of the air at that point. They couldn't have rebuilt them fast enough. It would have just compromised the whole final solution that was taking place at Auschwitz. And nah, we would have lost a plane. The Germans had no control of the air at that point. He shared a box with Hitler in Berlin at the 36 Olympics. Remember, that's the interwar period when a lot of Americans were rooting for Hitler and supporting him and financially investing in Germany to rebuild it so it'd be a counterbalance to the Russians. And he also opposed reparations for all the Japanese Americans who were interned in internment camps during World War II. The governor of California during that internment, he's the guy who implemented the internment policy in California, was Earl Warren, the guy in charge of this. And he seized all these Japanese homes and businesses and gave it away to people who voted his state. These are constituents who voted for him. He stole their property and gave it to his constituents. And but he was needed because he had such widespread respect. He's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Everybody holds him to a high standard. There's a lot of credibility in that position. And even though this is going to be a cover up, in order for the cover up to be to sell and to work, they needed a public face. LBJ needed a face for the commission that would convince the American people that it was legit. Earl Warren didn't want to be on it. LBJ sort of forced his hand and guilted him into participating. The guy who ran the commission was this guy. And obviously we know who he is, Alan Dulles. This is the original deep stater. I wouldn't call him the original. He was one of the originals. He's the guy we've been talking about from the beginning of this series to now. Here he is again. And this guy is overseeing assassinations as CIA director in Iran and Guatemala. He's killed countless thousands of Vietnamese citizens through Operation Phoenix. Um, I mean, I could go on and on about all the things Alan Dulles was involved in. He's the only guy at this time didn't have a full-time job. He never missed a meeting. This guy, it might as well have been called the Dulles Commission because he ran it. And he is the ultimate fox in charge of the hen house. And even Earl Warren said the commission should have been called the Dulles Commission. He was saying it as a matter of compliment. Thank God Alan Dulles was here. I, I had a day job, Dulles really ran the thing. And his job was to make sure that this deep state involvement in this plot, namely the CIA, but including the Pentagon and State Department and Secret Service, et cetera, et cetera. All of the government actors, the deep state actors, were protected. And he even went so far as to hide the merger of the CIA and the mob and its long effort to try to overthrow Castro's government, assassinate Castro. He hid that. And the investigation was really the FBI doing the investigation and giving the evidence that they had come up with. They would give the evidence to the commission, and the commission would weed through it, decide what was important and what wasn't. And the guy who was the filter of all that was Alan Dulles. And of course, J. Edgar Hoover was a filter on the FBI side, but ultimately, as far as the commission was concerned, it was Alan Dulles. And as opposed to all the other people who served on this commission, whom LBJ picked, and most of them said, okay, I'm not looking to do this. I don't really want to do this, but the way you present it, I'm doing a service for my country. I will do it. In Earl Warren's case, he cried. He begged not to be part. He had to be forced to do it, guilted into it. The only one who lobbied to be put on it was Alan Dulles. He made his intentions known right from the get-go. I want to be on that commission. And he was. So that concludes the LBJ part of this deep state cabal that operates unaccountable and unelected to the American people and is operating in its own self-interest, doesn't worry about the public interest, all about profit or benefit to themselves, and they figure out a way to immunize themselves from any civil or criminal liability afterwards. And because of that, they can commit treason. They have no fear of consequence. They can fight wars against America. They can aid and abet the enemy. They can overthrow our government like they do all over the world. They can do it here. And they can kill the king and not worry about it. They're immunized, completely immunized. And we've defined that this deep state during this period as the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. And I think hopefully we're demonstrating through this series just how interrelated the big industries and the national security apparatus were, and how the deep state is not nameless, it's not faceless, it's not an amorphous blob. It's actually made up of people who make decisions, choices. And LBJ was one of these people. That's it for today. We'll be moving on to the next part of this deep state cabal next week. But until then, God bless. Thank you.